In the sweltering heat of a Cuban summer, the thunderous sound of hooves mingled with the sharp crack of rifle fire. Dust rose from the earth, obscuring the silhouettes of men on horseback as they charged forward, their determination as unbreakable as the frontier spirit that forged them. These are no ordinary cavalry. They are the Rough Riders, a motley crew of cowboys, miners, lawmen, entertainers, sportsmen, and Native Americans, united under the banner of Colonel and future United States President Theodore Roosevelt. As they crested the hill of San Juan, their legend was about to be etched into the lore of American history. Born from the untamed spirit of the Old West and thrust into the crucible of international conflict, the Rough Riders embodied a unique moment in time, a bridge between two eras. They carried with them the rugged individualism of the frontier and the bold ambition of a nation on the cusp of becoming a world power. Their story is one of transformation, not just to the men who donned the uniform, but of America itself. From the dusty streets of Arizona Territory to the jungle-clad hills of Cuba, the Rough Riders blazed a trail that would lead the United States into a new century and a new role on the global stage. This is the story of Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. The first United States Volunteer Cavalry, popularly known as the Rough Riders, drew its members predominantly from the southwestern states of Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. These areas were selected for their arid climates, which mirrored the conditions the soldiers would encounter in Cuba. The regiment's formation was marked by an overwhelming surge of applicants, forcing recruiters to turn away many eager volunteers. As tensions escalated with Spain following the USS Maine incident, patriotic fervor swept through these states, prompting men from diverse walks of life to sign up. The unit's ranks swelled with an eclectic mix of individuals, including cowboys, prospectors, outdoorsmen, gamblers, indigenous people, and university students. These recruits shared a common proficiency in equestrian skill and marksmanship. Theodore Roosevelt noted that approximately half of the regiment originated from New Mexico. The unit also attracted law enforcement officers and military veterans, some of whom had participated in the Civil War or conflicts with Native American tribes. Many of these experienced individuals sought leadership roles within the regiment. While the recruits came from varied backgrounds, the Rough Riders boasted considerable military acumen in its upper echelons. Leonard Wood, a physician with connections to high-ranking government officials, was appointed colonel, while Theodore Roosevelt assumed the role of lieutenant colonel. A notable recruitment site was the bar at San Antonio's Menger Hotel, which continues to commemorate the Rough Riders with a collection of Roosevelt and regimental artifacts. The training regimen for the Rough Riders was relatively uncomplicated. Recruits engaged in typical military exercises and received instruction in discipline, conduct, and collaborative tactics, all crucial for their physical and psychological preparation. Given that many volunteers were already adept riders, training concentrated on enhancing their mounted combat abilities, including shooting from horseback and maneuvering in formation. In contrast to traditional cavalry units that employed sabers, the Rough Riders were trained in the use of carbines and revolvers, weapons with which they were more familiar. Officers expanded their knowledge through the study of tactical manuals and drill guides to ensure effective leadership. Even during periods of confinement on trains or ships, the men continued their studies to maintain combat readiness. The rapid assembly of military forces during the Spanish-American conflict resulted in significant casualties from illness, with typhoid fever being particularly lethal. Numerous soldiers succumbed to disease in southeastern U.S. training facilities before even reaching the combat zone itself. This contributed to the staggering toll of 5,083 fatalities attributed to non-combat causes throughout the war. Prior to commencing their training regimen, Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt leveraged his political influence to secure top-notch equipment for his regiment. The Rough Riders were outfitted with model 1896 carbines, chambered in 30 to 40 Krag, alongside Colt single-action Army sidearms. Their gear, including tents, attire, and equestrian equipment, matched that of regular Army units. The regiment's arsenal was further enhanced by a generous benefactor who provided 2 cutting-edge M1 895 Colt Browning machine guns, specifically boosting their combat capability. Bowie knives were also part of their standard kit. While their weapons and gear were regulation issued, the Rough Riders' uniforms were deliberately designed to reflect their frontier heritage. Their distinctive attire consisted of slouch hats, azure flannel shirts, earth-tone trousers, leg coverings, and sturdy footwear. Many members adorned themselves with casually tied neckcloths. This unique ensemble, embodying a rugged yet ready-for-action aesthetic, gave rise to their famous moniker, the Rough Riders. This nickname encapsulated their singular blend of frontier resilience and military precision. Despite receiving adequate training, the Rough Riders, like many units mobilized during this conflict, were not immune to the ravages of disease that plagued the war effort. The swift deployment of troops, while necessary for the war effort, inadvertently created conditions ripe for the spread of illness, highlighting the often overlooked dangers soldiers faced beyond the battlefield itself. And yet, the soon-to-be legends couldn't worry about viral disease or sharing pathogens around the base. They had a litany of conflicts and efforts of war facing them, coming clearer and clearer into view as each day passed by. All of the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry could focus on was the pending war that they'd wage across the southern United States. In late May of 1898, a contingent of 1,060 Rough Riders, accompanied by over 1,200 equines, embarked on a journey to Florida's Gulf Coast. Their destination was Tampa, where they anticipated boarding vessels bound for Cuba, under the command of Major General William Rufus Shafter. However, due to political urgency from the nation's capital, the deployment was hastened despite insufficient transportation capacity. This logistical constraint resulted in only 2/3 of the regiment's companies being able to depart, leaving behind numerous troops and most of their horses. The forced separation deeply affected the unit's morale, as recounted by Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt, who vividly described the emotional turmoil of those left behind. Compounding the setback, this regiment had already lost approximately a quarter of its trained personnel to tropical illnesses, such as malaria and yellow fever, further diminishing their fighting strength and spirits. Upon reaching Cuban shores on June 23, 1898, the Rough Riders found themselves severely under-equipped, having brought only what they could personally carry. They established a temporary base near their landing point while awaiting further instructions. The subsequent day saw additional supplies unloaded, including the few horses that had made the crossing. Reflecting on the campaign, Roosevelt later identified the critical shortage of transport as its most significant flaw, lamenting that access to their full complement of pack animals would have greatly enhanced the cavalry's division's logistical capabilities. The troops' provisions were meager, consisting of only a few days' rations to sustain them through physically demanding operations. The scarcity of mounts presented another formidable challenge. Despite their training as a mounted unit, the majority of Rough Riders were compelled to operate as foot soldiers, traversing extensive distances through Cuba's sweltering, humid, and densely forested terrain. This unexpected transition to infantry duties, for which they were ill-prepared, placed the regiment at a considerable disadvantage, even before engaging the enemy. The combination of inadequate supplies, unfamiliar roles, and harsh environmental conditions tested the Rough Riders' adaptability and resilience. Later that day, on June 23rd, as U.S. forces approached the Cuban coastline, Spanish military units stationed in Sigua, Siboney, and Daiquiri began a strategic withdrawal, During their retreat, the Spanish forces encountered a group of 250 Cuban fighters under the leadership of Colonel Carlos Gonzalez Clavel near Sevilla, situated east of Santiago de Cuba. This encounter resulted in a brief but intense firefight, with both sides incurring similar losses: 3 fatalities and 10 wounded for each party. Following this engagement, the Spanish troops fell back to a modestly fortified location at Las Guasimas de Sevilla, approximately 4 miles to the northwest of Siboney. Major General William Rufus Shafter, the commander-in-chief of U.S. operations in Cuba, assigned Brigadier General Henry Lawton, who led the 2nd Infantry Division of U.S. Volunteers, to oversee the amphibious landing. Initial intelligence suggested that the Spanish forces were bolstering their defensive positions with artillery. However, this information was contradicted by Cuban scouts, who reported that the Spanish were actually preparing to abandon their current position. On the same day, Major General Joseph Wheeler received directives from Shafter to establish a picket line to secure Siboney. Upon arrival, Wheeler learned that the Spanish forces were already in the process of withdrawing towards Sevilla, with a small contingent of about 100 Cuban fighters harassing their rear guard. Recognizing a tactical opportunity, Wheeler made the decision to launch an offensive against the new Spanish defensive line the following day. He collaborated closely with General Castillo, a Cuban officer, who provided crucial intelligence, including a detailed map of the Spanish fortifications. Armed with this information, Wheeler and General Young devised a plan to divide their forces into 2 columns. Colonel Leonard Wood would lead the Rough Riders on the left flank, while the 1st and 10th U.S. Cavalry regiments would advance on the right. This strategic planning and coordination between American and Cuban forces set the stage for the upcoming engagement, demonstrating the complex interplay of military intelligence, tactical decision-making, and alliance dynamics in the unfolding Cuban campaign. The Spanish defensive force, under the leadership of Brigadier General Otero Rubin, comprised approximately 1,500 soldiers and 2 artillery pieces. Their defense strategy involved 3 tiers: an initial line at a crucial intersection near Siboney's path, a secondary position at Asiento de Sevilla, and a tertiary stronghold at La Redonda. Rubin's troops included 3 infantry battalions: Puerto Rico, San Fernando, and Talavera Peninsular, bolstered by Spanish Loyalist volunteers, engineering units, and mountain artillery equipped with a pair of 75mm Krupp cannons. The American offensive force totaled 964 combatants, encompassing the Rough Riders, the 1st U.S. Regular Cavalry, and the 10th U.S. Cavalry, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, an African-American regiment. Their ranks were supplemented by artillery support and approximately 800 Cuban fighters under General Castillo's command. As the U.S. forces moved forward, they encountered their first grim indication of enemy presence: a fallen Cuban soldier on the roadside. The confrontation commenced with American artillery initiating the assault. The Spanish infantry retaliated with intense rifle fire, effectively immobilizing the advancing U.S. units. The Spanish troops wielded superior German-engineered Mauser rifles, which utilized smokeless powder ammunition. The technology advantage rendered the Spanish positions nearly invisible to the Americans, as the Mausers produced minimal visible discharge. Stephen Crane, an author present at the battle, later depicted the Mauser's report as a subtle, musical tone, or the sharp crack of a whip cutting through the air. Despite facing these formidable obstacles, the American forces persevered in their advance. The clash at Las Guasimas de Sevilla represented the inaugural significant engagement on Cuban soil for the Rough Riders and their fellow American troops, marking a pivotal moment in the unfolding campaign. On June 24, 1898, General Joseph Wheeler initiated an assault on the Spanish fortifications at Las Guasimas. His strategy involved encircling the initial Spanish defensive line, targeting both the front and right flank. Brigade Commander Samuel B.M. Young personally oversaw the positioning of Hotchkiss Field Artillery approximately 900 yards from the Spanish stronghold on an elevated position. Initially uncertain about the identity of the forces occupying the hill, Young ordered several test shots. The Spanish response, with their 75mm Krupp mountain artillery, confirmed their presence, marking the commencement of hostilities. Theodore Roosevelt later recounted the initial phase of the engagement, which involved the 1st and 10th Regular Cavalry. The American forces, navigating through dense tropical vegetation, struggled to pinpoint the well-concealed enemy, whose use of smokeless powder further complicated detection. General Young, eager for engagement, urged his troops forward despite the challenging terrain. The thick foliage led to some disorganization among the advancing units, with support elements occasionally intermingling with frontline troops. The soldiers encountered various obstacles, including wire fences and steep inclines, as they pressed onward. Despite these hurdles, American officers led courageously, inspiring their men to advance relentlessly towards the Spanish positions. Major Bell, leading his squadron, sustained injuries, but his men continued under Captain Wainwright's command. Other officers, including Captain Knox and Lieutenant Byram, though wounded, refused to abandon their posts, motivating their troops to maintain the offensive. Under General Young's direction, the advance persisted until American forces were within earshot of the Spanish entrenchments. Despite fierce resistance, U.S. soldiers scaled the ridges, compelling the Spanish to withdraw. While Spanish accounts claim to have repulsed American attacks twice, contemporary battlefield reports do not corroborate this assertion. On the left flank of the American advance, Captain Alan Caprone's reconnaissance unit discovered a deceased Spanish troop, indicating proximity to enemy lines. Upon receiving this intelligence, Colonel Leonard Wood, commanding the Rough Riders, orchestrated a tactical deployment, with Major Brodie leading the left wing and Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt directing the right. As this maneuver unfolded, a point man engaged and killed a Spanish soldier, triggering an immediate firefight. The Rough Riders pressed forward, forcing the Spanish to retreat to their secondary defensive line. Maintaining momentum, the Rough Riders eventually overwhelmed the final Spanish positions, establishing contact with the regular cavalry at the base of the hill on the battlefield's right flank. The engagement concluded around 9:30 a.m., with reinforcements from the 9th Cavalry arriving after the main action had subsided. Although the Spanish forces managed to temporarily check the American advance, they ultimately continued their withdrawal towards Santiago. This retreat led American observers to erroneously conclude that they had successfully pushed back the enemy. General Otero Rubin reported Spanish casualties at 7 dead and 7 wounded, though some sources suggest the toll may have been higher. Following orders from General Linares, many of the injured were evacuated in a convoy. In the aftermath of the Las Guasimas encounter, both sides claimed a measure of success. Rubin had effectively executed a rearguard action, facilitating the safe withdrawal of his troops, while avoiding the formidable naval artillery of the U.S. fleet. For the Americans, the skirmish served as a morale-boosting initial engagement in their Cuban campaign. Wheeler's forces subsequently regrouped, joining a contingent of 5,000 Cuban fighters under General Calido Garcia, and began preparations for assaulting the Spanish defense positions surrounding Santiago. Some American officers voiced criticism of Colonel Gonzalez Clavel, a Cuban commander, for his non-participation in the attack. However, Clavel had adhered to directives from General Lawton, a senior officer overseeing the landing, to maintain his position until the amphibious operation was complete. Both Lawton and Garcia later commended Gonzalez Clavel's adherence to orders. In retrospect, military analysts have posited that the Americans might have achieved a more decisive outcome had they opted for a flanking maneuver rather than a frontal assault on the Spanish position. Had the Spanish forces chosen to stand their ground, Wheeler's troops might have faced a significantly more challenging situation. One Rough Rider later reflected that the Americans were fortunate not to be facing a more formidable European power, such as England, suggesting they might not have fared as well in a prolonged engagement. Many of the Spanish soldiers who participated in the Las Guasimas encounter would later confront American forces yet again in the renowned Battle of San Juan Hill, the next captivating chapter in the legendary story that is the Rough Riders. On July 1st, 1898, General Arsenio Linares of Spain positioned 760 professional soldiers atop the San Juan Heights to counter the impending American offensive. Curiously, despite the imminent threat, Linares opted against bolstering these defenses, leaving a substantial force of nearly 10,000 Spanish troops in reserve within Santiago de Cuba, merely a few miles distant. This strategic decision baffled many contemporary observers, given the critical importance of the San Juan Heights. The Spanish fortifications on the hill were not optimally placed either. Some trenches and defensive structures were constructed along the geographic summit rather than the military crest, which would have afforded a superior angle for repelling advancing forces. Consequently, the Spanish defenders faced difficulties in targeting the Americans as they neared the hill's base, although the Americans became fully exposed to Spanish fire once they began their ascent. While most Spanish soldiers were recent conscripts, their officers possessed extensive combat experience from years of counterinsurgency operations against Cuban rebels. The Spanish forces were equipped with cutting-edge weaponry, including the 7mm Mauser M1893, a modern bolt-action firearm capable of rapid sustained fire. This rifle, utilizing high-velocity smokeless powder cartridges, provided the Spanish troops with a significant firepower advantage. Their artillery units were similarly outfitted with advanced, quick-firing breech-loading cannons, also employing smokeless powder, which again enhanced efficiency and concealment by producing minimal smoke. The American forces were armed with a variety of weapons. Regular infantry units carried Krag bolt-action rifles, which used smokeless powder and fired .30 Army caliber ammunition. However, equipment disparities existed within the American ranks. The 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments, known as Buffalo Soldiers, were still equipped with obsolete single-shot Springfield Model 1873 rifles, which fired black powder 45 to 70 cartridges. These firearms were slower to reload and produced more smoke, increasing user visibility to the enemy. The Rough Riders, a volunteer cavalry unit, were issued Krag rifles, while their officers, thanks to Colonel Theodore Roosevelt's intervention, wielded .30 caliber M1895 Winchester lever-action rifles, providing superior rapid-fire capability. Despite having modern rifles, American artillery lagged behind its Spanish counterpart. Their 3.2-inch field guns were slow-firing and relied on outdated black powder charges, limiting their range and effectiveness. The Americans did possess one notable advantage in their Gatling gun detachment, led by Lieutenant John Henry Parker. These hand-operated weapons, capable of discharging over 700 rounds per minute, were strategically positioned to provide intense suppressing fire for advancing troops. General William Rufus Shafter commanded the first overall American assault on Santiago de Cuba, leading approximately 15,000 troops in the 5th Army Corps. The corps was organized into 3 divisions. Jacob F. Kent commanded the 1st Division, Henry W. Lawton led the 2nd, and the Dismounted Cavalry Division, initially under Joseph Wheeler, was temporarily commanded by General Samuel S. Sumner due to Wheeler's illness. Shafter's battle plan involved a 2-pronged attack. Lawton's division was assigned to capture the Spanish stronghold at El Caney to the north, an operation expected to be completed within just 2 hours. Upon securing El Caney, Lawton's forces were to join the other divisions in assaulting the San Juan Heights. The remaining 2 divisions, under Sumner and Kent, were to advance directly against the heights, with Sumner in the center and Kent to the south. Shafter, also incapacitated by illness, established his command post at El Pozo, approximately 2 miles from the heights, and directed the battle through the mounted staff officers. The 1st Division, under Brigadier General Jacob Ford Kent, comprised 3 brigades. Brigadier General Hamilton Hawkins led the 1st Brigade, consisting of the 6th, 16th, and 71st Infantry Regiments. Colonel Edward P. Pearson commanded the 2nd Brigade, which included the 2nd, 10th, and 21st U.S. Infantry Regiments. The 3rd Brigade, led by Colonel Charles A. Wyckoff, was composed of the 9th, 13th, and 24th Infantry Regiments. The Cavalry Division, although operating on foot, played a crucial role. Its 1st Brigade, under General Sumner and Executive Officer Lieutenant Colonel Henry Carroll, included the 3rd, 6th, and 9th U.S. Cavalry units. Brigadier General Leonard Wood headed the 2nd Brigade, which encompassed the 1st U.S. Cavalry, 10th U.S. Cavalry, and the titular Rough Riders of the 1st Volunteer Cavalry. The American offensive line was arranged with various regiments positioned along the front. The left flank, targeting San Juan Hill, consisted of the 6th, 9th, 13th, 16th, and 24th Infantry units, along with the 10th Cavalry, the sole unit involved in assaults on both San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill. On the right flank, the 3rd Cavalry and the Rough Riders were tasked with capturing Kettle Hill. Throughout the engagement, American forces heavily relied on reconnaissance, even employing a hot air balloon to survey Spanish defenses, though this unfortunately became an easy target for enemy fire. As Kent's forces advanced, tragedy struck when Colonel Wyckoff, leading his brigade, was fatally hit by a Mauser round shortly after emerging from the forest. His successors, Lieutenant Colonel William Worth and Lieutenant Colonel Emerson Liscombe, were also quickly incapacitated, leaving Lieutenant Colonel Ezra Ewers to assume command. Meanwhile, Spanish forces atop San Juan Hill unleashed a barrage of gunfire on the advancing Americans. Troops sought shelter in the low-lying areas near the San Juan River, where they endured constant enemy fire. This perilous location earned the grim monikers Hell's Pocket and Bloody Ford due to the intense danger faced by the soldiers. As the battle unfolded, the 2nd and 10th Infantry Regiments took the initiative, advancing against the Spanish right flank and forcing enemy soldiers back towards their fortified positions. During this phase, 1st Lieutenant Jules Ord, temporarily attached to the 10th Infantry, approached General Hawkins with a bold proposition to spearhead a charge. Although Hawkins did not explicitly authorize the action, he did offer his tacit approval. Shortly thereafter, Ord led his unit forward, with the Buffalo Soldiers of the 10th Cavalry and the 24th Infantry following suit, ascending the hill, while the 16th Infantry provided rear support. A significant tactical advantage for the U.S. forces came from the newly established Gatling Gun Detachment under Lieutenant John Parker's command. These rapid-fire weapons, strategically placed about 600 yards from the San Juan blockhouse, unleashed a continuous barrage on Spanish positions. Despite casualties from heat exhaustion and enemy fire, Parker's unit maintained sustained fire, which proved instrumental in undermining Spanish morale. Eyewitnesses reported seeing some Spanish troops abandoning their trenches in the face of this overwhelming firepower. In the midst of the intense fighting, Major William Lawmen became the first officer to reach the summit of San Juan Hill, closely followed by Lieutenant Ord, who tragically sustained mortal wounds shortly after. The replacement of the Spanish flag with the American ensign atop the San Juan blockhouse marked a pivotal moment in the engagement. Subsequently, a Spanish counteroffensive was repelled by a combination of rifle and Gatling gun fire. Despite initial concerns from Shafter about the vulnerability of the American positions, Wheeler, having recovered from his illness, assured him of their defensibility, and troops were instructed to entrench for the night. Concurrently, on the adjacent Kettle Hill, Colonel Theodore Roosevelt led the Rough Riders and elements of the 3rd Cavalry in a nearly simultaneous assault, bolstered by Parker's Gatling guns, The intense suppressive fire from these weapons, described as a hail of bullets, enabled Roosevelt's men to advance with minimal opposition. As they scaled the hill, the Gatling fire provided crucial covering support, facilitating the charge. Throughout the engagement, soldiers from diverse backgrounds, including the white regulars, Buffalo Soldiers, and volunteers like Roosevelt's Rough Riders, fought in unison, united in their objective. Sergeant George Berry of the 10th Cavalry was recognized for being among the first to place his regiment's colors atop Kettle Hill, symbolizing their collective determination and valor. The successful seizure of both San Juan and Kettle Hills represented a significant triumph for the American forces, substantially weakening the Spanish defensive line. The coordinated efforts of infantry, cavalry, and machine gun units exemplified the evolving nature of warfare, highlighting the critical roles of coordination and modern technology. By nightfall, American troops had consolidated their positions, awaiting reinforcements, having secured a key strategic advantage in the campaign to capture Santiago. However, not all was quiet on San Juan Hill, as the Spanish counteroffensive was lurking around the corner. During the battle for San Juan Hill, Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, observing the intense fighting, decided to leave his position on Kettle Hill to support the ongoing struggle. He called for his men to follow as he charged forward, but initially, only a handful of Rough Riders heard and joined him. Realizing his small contingent, Roosevelt returned to gather more troops. With a larger force in tow, he led them down Kettle Hill's gentler western slope, passing a small body of water, aiming to reinforce the northern section of San Juan Hill. However, upon arrival, they found the summit battle had concluded. General Samuel Sumner intercepted Roosevelt, firmly ordering him back to Kettle Hill to prepare for a potential Spanish counteroffensive. Roosevelt complied, but upon return, his men were exhausted, and even his mount was overcome by the intense heat. When the counterattack eventually came, his force's effectiveness was diminished. Following the American capture of San Juan Hill, two of Lieutenant John Parker's rapid-fire weapons were transported by pack animals to a newly secured ridge. As American forces established their positions, Spanish troops launched a counterattack. While quickly repelled on San Juan Hill, the situation on Kettle Hill was far more precarious, with approximately 120 Spanish soldiers attacking. Colonel Leonard Wood requested Parker to relocate some of his guns to Kettle Hill, but Parker had an alternative strategy. He instructed Sergeant Green to use one of the guns on San Juan Hill to provide flanking fire, effectively neutralizing all but 40 of the attacking forces. After repelling the counteroffensive, Parker personally inspected Kettle Hill. He was joined by Sergeant Weigel's gun crew, previously prevented from engaging by Lieutenant Miley, who was conducting troop inspections. Parker immediately ordered Weigel's team to deploy their weapon on Kettle Hill, which proved crucial in eliminating Spanish sharpshooter fire targeting American positions. Back on San Juan Hill, Parker repositioned his two guns near a road for protection from Spanish artillery. Despite this, though, they came under fire from a large Spanish cannon. Using field glasses to locate the enemy gun, Parker directed his weapons to engage it. The American guns opened fire and successfully silenced the Spanish artillery from about 2,000 yards away. On July 4th, Parker had 3 of his guns moved to the battle line encircling Santiago. Their wheeled supports were removed, and the guns, along with 2 additional machine guns donated by Roosevelt, were placed in defensive positions. The 4th gun was repaired and deployed at Fort Canosa, where it fired thousands of rounds into Santiago during the siege, contributing to the eventual Spanish capitulation. American casualties were more than double those of their Spanish adversaries. Although the Spanish fought tenaciously, losing a third of their forces, they captured a few American prisoners. The heavy American losses from Spanish small arms fire prompted the army to modernize its weaponry. Older rifle models were swiftly replaced by more advanced designs. Similarly, the outdated rapid-fire guns were superseded by newer machine guns by 1909. The American campaign faced further setbacks when General Henry Lawton's division, expected on July 1, 1898, arrived an entire day late due to unexpected resistance at El Caney. Upon Lawton's arrival, American forces, supported by Cuban insurgents, began besieging Santiago. The city eventually surrendered on July 17, 1898, more than 2 weeks later. While Roosevelt and his Rough Riders gained considerable fame, other courageous soldiers went unrecognized. Lieutenant Jules Ord, who led the crucial charge, never received widespread acknowledgement. Once again, the 1st Volunteer Cavalry marched on as growing legends. Before Teddy Roosevelt and his company of Rough Riders could collect their flowers, one last major siege necessitated their services. Because the American Fifth Army Corps' primary objective in Cuba was to secure the strategically important city of Santiago de Cuba, following their victory at Las Guasimas, U.S. forces pushed the Spanish back to their main defensive line along the San Juan Heights, which guarded Santiago. The aforementioned Battle of San Juan Hill saw American troops successfully overrun these Spanish defenses. Concurrently, at El Caney, U.S. forces had captured another fortified Spanish position, allowing them to consolidate their hold on San Juan Hill. The destruction of the Spanish fleet and the Battle of Santiago de Cuba eliminated any significant naval threat, enabling American forces to besiege the city unimpeded. On July 3, 1898, Major General William Pecos Bill Shafter initiated the formal siege. He established his army's position on the San Juan Heights, while General Henry W. Lawton's division, advancing from El Caney, secured the northern flank. Cuban insurgents under General Calido Garcia extended the American defensive line to the bay northwest of the city. The Spanish, now under the command of General José Toral y Velázquez, who replaced the severely wounded General Arsenio Linares, maintained robust defensive positions with the aid of German military advisors, despite their weakened state. As the siege progressed, American artillery positioned on the heights bombarded Santiago relentlessly. U.S. forces, aided by Cuban rebels, cut off the city's water and food supplies. On the day the siege commenced, a Spanish relief column broke through the Cuban lines, reinforcing General Toral's forces to approximately 13,500 men. The following day, a temporary ceasefire allowed for the evacuation of 20,000 civilians from Santiago. Supporting the siege operations, Lieutenant John Parker's 430 caliber Gatling guns were deployed once again at Fort Canosa, alongside other artillery pieces. Over the next 2 weeks, these Gatling guns fired thousands of rounds into Santiago, inflicting significant casualties on the Spanish defenders. On July 8th, General Toral proposed surrendering Santiago in exchange for his troops' evacuation to Holguin. American authorities in Washington rejected this offer, ending the temporary truce on July 10th. The situation grew more critical for Shafter as yellow fever began to spread among his troops. Despite continued bombardments by both Shafter's forces and Admiral William T. Sampson's naval units, little military progress was achieved. On July 11th, General Nelson A. Miles arrived with reinforcements, including additional regiments and artillery, bolstering the American position. As the calendar turned to mid-July, all involved parties were keen to bring the military operation to a rapid end. On the 13th of that month, discussions regarding Santiago's capitulation commenced when 4 high-ranking officers, Generals Toral, Shafter, Miles, and Joseph Wheeler, convened beneath a substantial tree situated between the opposing forces. The American side put forth conditions originating from War Secretary Russell A. Alger, which encompassed the return of Spanish military personnel to their homeland. A significant contributor to the surrender talks was Shafter's associate, Dr. George E. Goodfellow, who is well versed in Spanish. It's said that he even employed a container of spirits to foster a more relaxed atmosphere during the deliberations. 3 days later, on July 16th, after both governments had accepted the surrender terms, maybe thanks to a little bit of alcohol, General Toral formally yielded, relinquishing command of his 13,500-strong garrison, as well as an additional 9,000 troops stationed in the broader Santiago division. The agreement also saw Spain ceding authority over Guantanamo City and San Luis over to the United States. The following day, Spanish forces ceremoniously marched out of Santiago, signaling the cessation of major combat operations in Cuba. Despite this development, the conflict had not reached its conclusion. As July drew to a close, a trio of diseases, the aforementioned yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery, had rapidly proliferated through the ranks of the U.S. Army. By the 28th of the month, approximately 4,000 American troops were afflicted, prompting numerous officers, including Theodore Roosevelt himself, to push for the withdrawal of forces from Cuba. Roosevelt's widely circulated missive, referred to as the Round Robin, was leaked to media outlets, drawing attention to the health crisis. In response to the situation, the 5th Army Corps was ordered back to American soil and relocated to Camp Wyckoff. Of the 20,000 personnel stationed at this facility, 257 ultimately succumbed to ailments such as the yellow fever and malaria. In the wake of the viral siege, the Red Cross vessel City of Texas, with the legendary Clara Barton on board, became the inaugural ship to enter Santiago's harbor. While the initial strategies called for a substantial offensive against Havana, the subsequent major military initiative of the war shifted its focus to Puerto Rico, under the leadership of General Miles. The Rough Riders could finally return home, their impact on the Spanish-American War now the stuff of legends, etched into the concrete of American history at large. On August 14, 1898, Colonel Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders concluded their Cuban expedition, landing at Montauk Point on Long Island, New York. There, they rejoined 4 units that had remained in Tampa, Florida. Roosevelt observed that the men who hadn't participated in the Cuban campaign felt remorseful about missing the conflict. However, he stressed that their commitment to duty was equally valuable as those who had seen combat, emphasizing that fulfilling one's responsibilities took precedence over seeking personal acclaim. At Montauk, the troops received medical attention, with nurses like Sister Regina Pertel earning high praise for their dedication. Many soldiers had fallen ill with those pesky tropical diseases during their deployment, leaving them severely debilitated well after the fighting stopped. These ailments proved fatal for some, while others were transported back to the United States under strict quarantine measures. Malaria proved particularly tenacious and lethal, with some veterans continuing to suffer or succumb to the disease even after returning home. Despite their poor health, most soldiers did gradually recover, thanks to improved nutrition and healthcare at Montauk. The remainder of their stay at Camp Wyckoff was characterized by festivities commemorating their Cuban triumph. The Rough Riders were presented with 3 unique mascots: a mountain lion named Josephine, an eagle christened after Roosevelt, and a small dog called Cuba, all symbolizing the diverse backgrounds of the regiment's members. They also informally adopted a young boy who had attempted to sneak aboard their ship to Cuba, outfitting him with a miniature Rough Riders uniform and granting him honorary membership in the unit. As a gesture of appreciation for Roosevelt's leadership, the troops gifted him a bronze sculpture titled the Bronco Buster, depicting a cowboy taming a wild horse. Roosevelt found this present particularly fitting for his regiment, many of whom were accomplished equestrians. Following the presentation, each soldier shook Roosevelt's hand in a poignant farewell. On September 15, 1898, the Rough Riders officially disbanded. They returned their gear, weapons, and horses to the U.S. government and bid each other farewell. Before parting ways, however, Roosevelt delivered a speech praising their valor and reminding them that their return to civilian life would demand the same level of dedication and effort they had demonstrated during the war. For many veterans, reintegrating into society proved challenging. Some were unable to resume their previous occupations due to injuries or illness, prompting affluent supporters to establish funds for struggling veterans. However, many former soldiers were too proud to accept assistance. In 1899, a year after their dissolution, the Rough Riders gathered for their inaugural reunion in Las Vegas, New Mexico. Theodore Roosevelt, who had ascended to the position of New York governor, participated in the event and conveyed his appreciation to the troops, with particular emphasis on those hailing from the Southwest. Teddy pledged his support for New Mexico's aspiration to achieve statehood, a cause he continued to champion throughout his presidency. Roosevelt's advocacy played a significant role in paving the way for Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona to eventually attain statehood. During World War I, Roosevelt endeavored to establish another volunteer division reminiscent of the Rough Riders. Congress authorized him to enlist up to 4 divisions of volunteers for combat in France, and he selected officers to assist in leading this initiative. Despite initial enthusiasm, President Woodrow Wilson ultimately vetoed the plan, forcing Roosevelt to dismantle the unit before it could be mobilized. Nevertheless, one of Roosevelt's trusted Rough Riders, Brigadier General John Campbell Greenway, served with distinction in the 101st Infantry Regiment during the conflict, garnering multiple accolades for his valor. To commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Rough Riders' disbandment all the way in 1948, the U.S. Postal Service issued a special stamp honoring the regiment. The stamp featured an image of Captain William Owen "Bucky" O'Neill, who lost his life while leading his troops during the Battle of San Juan Hill. The Rough Riders maintained their tradition of annual reunions in Las Vegas, New Mexico, all the way until 1967, when Jesse Langdon, the sole surviving veteran, attended the final gathering. At its zenith, the Rough Riders boasted 56 officers and 994 enlisted men upon their initial muster. By the time of their disbandment, these numbers had grown to 76 officers and 1,090 enlisted men. Their casualties during service included 2 officers and 24 enlisted men, who were either killed in action or succumbed to wounds, as well as 19 soldiers who perished due to disease. Despite these losses, the Rough Riders' courage and service left an indelible mark on American military history. The final 3 surviving members of the regiment were Frank C. Brito, Jesse Langdon, and Ralph Waldo Taylor. Brito, a native of Las Cruces, New Mexico, enlisted alongside his brother in May 1898, but did not deploy to Cuba. He subsequently pursued careers as a mining engineer and lawman before passing away in 1973 at the age of 96. Langdon, who enlisted at the tender age of 16, shared a personal connection with Roosevelt, as his father had tended to Roosevelt's cattle during his ranching days. Langdon died in 1975, and his passing marked the conclusion of the regiment's living legacy. Ralph Waldo Taylor, the last known Rough Rider, departed this life in 1987 at the remarkable age of 105 years old. His service to the New York National Guard during the Spanish-American War signaled the conclusion of a legendary chapter in U.S. history. The Rough Riders, with their diverse backgrounds and indomitable spirit, left an indelible mark on the American West and the nation's collective imagination. Their brief but intense military service during the Spanish-American War became a powerful symbol of American courage, adaptability, and frontier ethos. Long after the dust settled on the battlefields of Cuba, the legend of the Rough Riders continued to inspire generations of Americans. Their story embodies the transition of the Old West into the modern era, blending the rugged individualism of cowboys and frontiersmen with the emerging role of the United States as a global power. The legacy of the Rough Riders, led by their larger-than-life Theodore Roosevelt, endures not just in the history books, but in the very fabric of American culture, reminding us of a time when the spirit of the West rode forth to shape the destiny of a nation.